The first day at a new school is never easy. For some, it is a chance to start fresh, to meet new friends, to create a new image. For others, it is a nightmare, filled with unknown faces, silent stares, and the crushing weight of being different. For Alina, it was a little of both. Jefferson High was alive that morning. The hallways pulsed with energy as students hurried through the doors, their laughter echoing against the walls. Sneakers squeaked across polished floors, lockers slammed shut like drums, and voices rose and fell in an unending wave of noise. To most, it was a typical Monday, the start of another ordinary school year. But for Alina, it was the start of something far from ordinary. At 16, she carried herself with a kind of quiet caution that stood out even more than she wished. Her dark hair framed her thoughtful eyes, and her steps were measured, almost hesitant. She had walked into schools before, many in fact, and each time it felt the same. A new building, new faces, new whispers. The only constant was the knot in her stomach that refused to loosen. Her backpack felt heavy on her shoulders, though it contained little more than notebooks and pencils. She pressed the straps tightly, as if the weight could anchor her, keep her from drifting under the tide of attention that was already beginning to form. She knew the rules of survival in a new place. Keep your head down, don't make waves, and maybe, if you're lucky, people will forget you're there. But invisibility is impossible in high school. As she made her way down the hallway, she could feel the stares. A group of girls leaned against their lockers, their voices dropping to whispers as she passed. "Who's that?" one asked, just loud enough for Alina to hear. "She must be new," another replied, her tone carrying more judgment than curiosity. A boy walked by, glanced at her, and smirked to his friends. They chuckled, not cruelly, at least not yet, but the sound stuck in Alina's ears. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, pretending not to notice. But every whisper, every sideways glance, chipped at her already fragile calm. She had been here before, in different schools, in different towns, and it always began the same way. First, the whispers, then the rumors, and sooner or later, the cruelty. The hallway stretched on endlessly, lined with faces she didn't know, lockers that looked identical, bulletin boards filled with announcements that meant nothing to her. Each step felt heavier than the last, and still, she pushed forward. She told herself she could make it through the day. One day at a time, that was how she had survived before. But as she moved, her thoughts drifted to the life she had left behind. The familiar streets of her old neighborhood, the room that had once felt like hers, the small comforts she had lost. Most of all, she thought of the voice that reminded her, time and again, that she was stronger than she believed. A voice that told her family was more than blood, that she was loved, no matter what the world thought. That voice belonged to her father. The memory steadied her for a moment. But here, in the crowded halls of Jefferson High, no one knew who she was. To them, she was just the new girl, quiet, shy, a stranger walking among them. And that was how she wanted it. She had no desire to stand out. The last thing she needed was more attention. But fate has a way of ignoring the plans we make for ourselves. Across the hallway, leaning casually against a locker, stood Derek, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came not from kindness, but from control. Everyone at Jefferson High knew Derek. Some laughed at his jokes, some followed him, and many feared him. He was loud, sharp, and relentless. He enjoyed the power he held over others, the way a smirk or a cruel word could change the atmosphere of a room. And now, his eyes were fixed on Alina. He noticed her immediately. The way she kept her head down, the way she clutched her backpack like a shield, the way she moved as if hoping the floor would swallow her whole. To Derek, she was not just another student. She was an opportunity, new, alone, vulnerable, perfect. He nudged one of his friends, tilting his head toward her. "Who's that?" he asked, though the question was more rhetorical than curious. His friend shrugged, smirking. Derek's grin widened. "Doesn't matter. I'll take care of her." Alina did not see him watching. She did not hear his words. She was too focused on reaching her first classroom, on taking one step after another without falling apart. But the truth was, her story at Jefferson High had already begun to unfold. She thought she could slip through unnoticed, that she could simply survive the day. But someone had already chosen her, someone who thrived on making others small, someone who would make sure she could not stay invisible. By the second period of the morning, Alina already felt the heavy pressure of eyes following her. She had slipped quietly into her first class, choosing a seat at the back near the window, hoping the sunlight might soften the tightness in her chest. She barely spoke when the teacher asked her name, her voice steady but quiet, enough for people to notice her hesitation. It wasn't long before whispers began to chase her from classroom to classroom. Some students looked back at her curiously, as though she were a puzzle waiting to be solved. Others smiled in ways that weren't entirely friendly, as if her mere presence gave them something new to gossip about. Alina could feel it, the way people's glances lingered just a second too long, the way small groups of friends leaned toward each other as she passed. At lunch, the air grew heavier. Jefferson High's cafeteria was a storm of noise, trays clattering, voices overlapping, laughter rising in waves. Alina stepped inside slowly, clutching her lunch with uncertainty. The room felt like an arena, tables divided into territories, already claimed by cliques and circles of friends who had known each other for years. There was no space for her, no welcoming face. She scanned the room, hoping to find a quiet corner. A few heads turned as she walked past. "That's the new girl," someone whispered. "Where's she from?" another asked. No one had answers, but that didn't stop the murmurs. Some whispered about her appearance, others about her silence. The cafeteria was a perfect breeding ground for rumors, and Alina was the new subject. Finally, she chose an empty table at the far side of the room. She sat alone, her tray untouched, eyes lowered, as if eating quietly could make her disappear. But across the cafeteria, Derek noticed her again. He sat surrounded by his friends, loud and confident, a grin always at the edge of his lips. His presence drew attention as easily as a flame drew moths. People laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny, simply because of who he was. And when he wanted to hurt someone, most stayed silent, rather than risk becoming his next target. Derek leaned back in his chair, tapping his fork against the table as he watched Alina. His friend beside him noticed. "She's sitting all alone," he muttered. Derek smirked. "Of course she is. That's what happens to new kids." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But there's something about her. She thinks she can hide, but she can't." His words were casual, but his tone carried weight. His friends nodded, half amused, half expectant. They knew Derek well. Once he set his sights on someone, it was only a matter of time before things escalated. Meanwhile, Alina kept her head down. She wasn't eating, just moving the food around her plate, trying to ignore the laughter that echoed too loudly from Derek's table. She could feel his gaze on her, even if she didn't look up. After lunch, the whispers grew louder. Students in the hallway repeated small fragments they had overheard in the cafeteria. She doesn't talk much. Did you see her sitting by herself? She's strange. Some were harmless observations, but mixed within them was mockery, judgment, and the kind of careless cruelty that teenagers threw around without realizing the damage they caused. Alina walked with her shoulders tight, her steps quick. She told herself it didn't matter. She had faced worse before. Whispers were only words, and words couldn't break her. At least, that's what she tried to believe. But Derek's presence loomed larger with every passing hour. He was no longer just watching. He was preparing. The whispers that drifted through the hallways were like kindling, and he was the spark waiting to set it all ablaze. Alina didn't know it yet, but the walls of Jefferson High had already chosen sides. Some would stand by silently, some would laugh at her expense, and a few might try to help. But Derek's shadow stretched further than most dared to challenge. As the final bell rang, Alina felt the weight of the day settle over her like a storm cloud. She gathered her books slowly, careful not to make noise, and headed for the exit. She thought perhaps tomorrow would be easier, that maybe the whispers would fade, but she was wrong. The whispers were only the beginning. By the third day, Alina had learned the rhythm of Jefferson High. The hallways buzzed like a hive, the classrooms carried a mix of boredom and chatter, and the cafeteria at lunch was the loudest place of all. To most students, it was the highlight of their day. To Alina, it felt like stepping onto a stage where every seat in the audience was filled with eyes that never stopped watching. She entered the cafeteria slowly, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. The smell of greasy pizza and fries filled the air, and the echo of laughter bounced off the walls. Alina scanned the room, searching for Emily. Maybe she'd sit with her today. Maybe she wouldn't have to eat alone. She spotted Emily at a back table, waving discreetly. Relief washed over Alina as she started toward her, weaving between crowded tables. But before she could reach her, a chair scraped loudly across the floor. Derek. He stood up from his usual table in the center of the room, his friends snickering as they watched him step into Alina's path. "Well, well," Derek said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "If it isn't our brand new star." His grin widened as conversations around the cafeteria began to quiet. Students leaned in, curious, eager for entertainment. Alina froze, her tray balanced in her hands. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want trouble. She never did. But Derek's smirk told her he wasn't giving her a choice. "You think you're too good to sit with anyone?" Derek asked, circling her like a predator. "Or maybe you just think you don't belong here at all?" Laughter rippled through the cafeteria. Alina clenched her jaw, her eyes fixed on the floor. She refused to answer. "Oh, come on," Derek pressed, his tone mocking. "Say something. Or do you only talk to your own kind?" The words cut sharp, heavy with racism, and the silence that followed was deafening. Alina's hands tightened on her tray. She wanted to scream, to throw his words back at him, but her father's voice echoed in her head again. "Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's standing tall when they want you to break." Emily suddenly stood up from her table. "Leave her alone, Derek," she shouted. A few heads turned in surprise. Derek glanced at Emily, then back at Alina, his smirk never fading. "Relax," he said, chuckling. "We're just welcoming her, right, guys?" His friends laughed on cue, their voices loud and cruel. Alina's throat tightened, but she lifted her chin. She looked Derek straight in the eyes. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't lower her gaze. "I don't need your welcome," she said quietly, her voice steady. A murmur spread through the cafeteria. Derek's smirk faltered for just a second before twisting back into a grin. "Oh, she's got a mouth on her," he said, his tone sharp. "This is going to be fun." He stepped back, letting her pass, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. Alina walked quickly to Emily's table and sat down, her tray untouched, her hands still trembling slightly. Emily leaned closer and whispered, "You were brave." But Alina didn't feel brave. She felt like a target. And deep down, she knew Derek wouldn't let this go. The cafeteria showdown had left its mark. By the next morning, whispers traveled faster than the bell. Alina didn't need to hear every word to know they were about her. She could feel it in the way eyes followed her, in the sudden hush that fell when she entered a hallway, and in the sideways glances that burned into her back. Rumors had begun, twisted versions of what had happened in the cafeteria. Some said she snapped at Derek. Others claimed she had cursed at him, even thrown food. None of it was true, but the truth didn't matter. At Jefferson High, rumors were stronger than facts. As she walked to her locker, a group of girls passed by, giggling. "That's her," one whispered loudly on purpose. "The new girl who thinks she's tough." Another added with a sneer, "She won't last a week." They laughed and walked away, leaving Alina staring at the cold metal door of her locker, her stomach heavy. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want to stand out. But the more she tried to fade into the background, the more the shadows of gossip pulled her into the spotlight. Emily found her between classes. "Hey," she said, walking quickly to match Alina's pace. "Don't listen to them. They're just bored and need someone to talk about." Alina forced a small smile. "Yeah, easy for you to say," Emily frowned. "I know it's not the same, but you were strong yesterday. People noticed. Not in the way I wanted," Alina muttered. They turned a corner, and Alina froze. Derek stood at the far end of the hallway, his arms crossed, his friends flanking him like bodyguards. He wasn't laughing this time. He just watched her with cold amusement, like a cat studying its prey. "See," Emily whispered. "He's trying to scare you." Alina's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to keep walking. As they passed, Derek leaned forward just enough for his words to reach her. "You really should learn your place." His tone was low, sharp, meant only for her. Emily bristled. "Back off, Derek." But Derek only smirked, stepping aside with exaggerated politeness. "Ladies first." His friends snickered as Alina and Emily walked past. The rest of the day blurred, but the weight of Derek's stare never left her. Even in class, she could feel it, like a shadow that stretched too far. By the time the final bell rang, her nerves were raw. She left school quickly, hoping the cool air outside would calm her. The parking lot was filled with students climbing into cars, laughing as if the world had no edges. But Alina walked alone, her steps fast, her eyes flicking over her shoulder. She didn't see Derek, but she didn't need to. His presence clung to her like a warning. For the first time since she'd arrived, Alina wondered if Jefferson High was more than just another school to survive. Something told her this was different, darker, and no matter how much she wanted to stay invisible, the shadows were already moving closer. By the end of her first week at Jefferson High, Alina knew Derek was only waiting for the right moment. His stares, his whispers, the way his friends laughed whenever she walked by. It was all leading to something. She just didn't know when it would happen. That Friday, the cafeteria was unusually loud. The football team had won their first game of the season the night before, and the players strutted through the room like kings. Derek wasn't on the team, but he didn't need to be. His presence carried the same weight. Alina sat at the back with Emily, pushing food around her tray. She felt the energy in the room shift before she even saw him. Derek rose from his table in the middle, his friends trailing behind like shadows. The noise quieted, anticipation building. Everyone seemed to know what was about to happen. He walked straight to her table. Emily stiffened, whispering, "Don't react. That's what he wants." Derek stopped in front of them, his grin wide, his voice carrying so the whole cafeteria could hear. "You know, I've been thinking. Our school has rules, traditions, and people like you," he paused, looking directly at Alina, "don't really fit." Snickers erupted from the crowd. Alina sat frozen, her pulse racing. Derek reached down suddenly, snatching her lunch tray off the table. Without hesitation, he tipped it, spilling food onto the floor. "Oops," he said, feigning innocence. Laughter roared through the cafeteria. Emily jumped to her feet. "What's your problem, Derek?" she shouted. But Derek only smirked, towering over Alina. "You don't belong here," he said quietly enough for only her to hear. His voice was sharp, almost venomous, "and I'm gonna make sure you remember that." Alina's hands trembled under the table, but she forced herself not to cry, not to give him the satisfaction. She looked him in the eye, steady but silent. "Pick it up," Derek sneered, nodding to the mess on the floor. His friends laughed harder. Alina stood slowly. For a moment, the cafeteria went quiet, expecting her to obey. But instead of bending down, she lifted her chin. "No." The word was soft, but it cut through the air like a blade. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Derek's grin faltered, then twisted into something darker. "You've got guts," he said, his voice low with anger. "But guts won't save you." He dropped the tray onto the table with a loud clang and walked away, his friends jeering behind him. The room buzzed with whispers. Some students looked impressed, others looked nervous, but all of them knew one thing: Derek wouldn't let this go. Emily sat back down, her voice trembling. That was amazing. But dangerous Alina finally let out the breath she had been holding. Her hands were still shaking, but her eyes were clear. For the first time, she felt something other than fear. She felt defiance. But deep down, she knew Emily was right. Derek had struck first, and this was only the beginning. The weekend couldn't come fast enough. After Derek's stunt in the cafeteria, Alina spent the last few periods of Friday with her stomach twisted into knots. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the food spilling across the floor, the laughter that followed, the way Derek's smirk burned into her like a brand. But when Saturday arrived, she didn't feel relief. The quiet of her bedroom made the memory louder. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene again and again. She hated that his voice still echoed in her head, hated that his words clung to her like smoke. "You don't belong here." Her phone buzzed. A message from Emily. "Don't let him get to you. Monday will be better." Alina wished she could believe that, but deep down, she knew Derek wasn't finished. When Monday came, her steps felt heavier than usual. The hallways seemed narrower, the whispers sharper. Some students gave her looks of pity, others of amusement. A few even smiled at her as though they admired her defiance in the cafeteria, but admiration didn't make her feel safer. At her locker, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay steady. That was the wall she had built over years of being the outsider. The calm mask, the silence, the refusal to break. But now, cracks were forming. She could feel them every time she remembered the laughter, every time she thought of Derek's warning glare. Emily appeared at her side, her presence a small comfort. "You holding up?" she asked. "Trying," Alina admitted. "You don't have to go through this alone," Emily said firmly. "He's not as untouchable as he thinks." But Alina shook her head. "You don't get it. People like him. People listen to him. They follow." Emily frowned. "Then maybe it's time someone stopped following." The words were meant to be encouraging, but they only reminded Alina how isolated she was. She wasn't like the other students. Her skin, her background, even the way she carried herself made her different. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase that difference. Later in class, she felt Derek's eyes on her again. He sat 3 rows back, tapping his pen on the desk, his smirk never fading. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was heavier than words. Every tap of the pen was a reminder. This isn't over. By the end of the day, Alina's mask was slipping. She ducked into the girls' restroom and splashed cold water on her face. Staring at her reflection, she barely recognized the girl in the mirror. Her dark eyes looked tired, her braids slightly messy, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. For a moment, she let herself feel the weight. She let herself crack. But then she heard her father's voice in her memory, steady and strong. "The world won't always welcome you. Sometimes it will push you down. But you are stronger than they think." Alina straightened slowly. Her reflection changed, not in appearance, but in spirit. Her shoulders lifted, her eyes sharpened. She wasn't broken. Not yet. She grabbed her bag and walked out of the restroom. Derek was still waiting for his chance, but he hadn't won. The cracks in the wall were real, but the foundation was stronger than he knew. By the second week, Alina had learned one thing with certainty. Derek wasn't going to stop. His stares followed her through the hallways. His smirk lingered in every class. His friends whispered cruel jokes just loud enough for her to hear. It wasn't random anymore. It was planned, deliberate, like he was tightening a net around her. The morning felt ordinary at first. Alina walked into school with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her head held a little higher than usual. She had decided not to let Derek control her day. If she pretended he didn't exist, maybe he would get bored. Maybe the storm would pass. But storms don't pass when someone like Derek controls the weather. It started between second and third period. The hallway was crowded, students rushing to class. Alina moved quickly, her books pressed to her chest. She was almost at her classroom when she felt it, a sudden hard shove from behind. Her books flew from her hands, scattering across the floor. She stumbled forward, barely catching herself. Laughter erupted around her like an explosion. Alina turned sharply, and there he was, Derek, standing a few feet away with that same cruel grin. His friends leaned against the lockers, watching like it was a show put on just for them. "Careful, new girl," Derek said loudly. "Hallways can be dangerous." The crowd laughed again. Heat rushed through Alina's face. She dropped to her knees, gathering her books with shaking hands. Students around her whispered, some amused, some uncomfortable, but none of them moved to help. Derek stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "What's the matter? Can't handle a little bump?" Alina's chest tightened. She forced herself to stand, clutching her books tightly. She didn't answer. She refused to give him what he wanted. But Derek wasn't finished. He reached out and knocked one of her books from her arms again. It hit the floor with a heavy slap. "Oops," he said, mockingly. "Guess you should be more careful." For a second, Alina thought she might snap. Her fingers dug into the edges of her books, her body trembling with anger she couldn't release. She wanted to scream at him, to shove him back, to prove she wasn't weak. But her father's words held her still. Strength isn't always what you do. Sometimes it's what you refuse to do. Emily suddenly appeared at her side, glaring at Derek. "Stop it," she shouted. "You think this makes you tough? Picking on someone who didn't do anything to you?" The hallway went quiet. Derek tilted his head, studying Emily with a smirk. "Careful," he said. "You wouldn't want to end up on the wrong side." Emily didn't back down. She bent down, picked up the fallen book, and handed it to Alina. "Come on," she said softly. Alina took the book, her hands still trembling. She wanted to thank Emily, but her throat felt tight. All she could do was walk with her friend toward class, her chest heavy with humiliation. Behind them, Derek called out, his voice echoing down the hall. "This isn't over, new girl." Alina's steps faltered, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew the truth. Derek had crossed a line. And from now on, the danger wasn't just whispers or stares. It was real,